Did you hear about the big news from Canberra today?
One Nation leader Pauline Hanson has sparked outrage in the Senate, walking in wearing a clothing item worn by Muslim women.
She did in 2017, Mark, again walking into the chamber in a burqa.
Pauline Hanson is suspended from the Senate after another burqa stunt.
And did you hear the people who were offended?
Clearly, what has happened today is not a genuine demonstration of faith. In fact, it is the middle finger to people of faith. It is extremely racist and unsafe.
What we should not do in this place, whatever views we may have on policy, is to be this disrespectful.
But racism should not be the choice of the Senate. This is a racist senator displaying blatant racism and Islamophobia, President.
Yeah, a lot of noise, a lot of distraction, but I actually think the biggest thing that happened in Canberra today has something to do with China. The number 3 representative of the Chinese Communist Party was in Australia today, as you can see, meeting the Governor-General at Yarralumla. But the story that I think is pretty important to notice here is that this friendly nation, who of course with open arms we welcome into our federal parliament, well, federal MPs and staffers were told today, turn off your phone, get off the internet, when any of the Chinese staff from the CCP, again, not the good people of China, but the people who run it, come to our country. In fact, Andrew Clennell explains how this works. Now remember, this does not happen when the Americans roll into town. It does not happen when Pacific Island leaders are here. This is reserved for the big, beautiful friend who can move elections, who can damage our trade, yet still we never call them out.
Interestingly, this is part of the note. There may be intermittent disruptions to Wi-Fi access during the periods outlined above. Within the identified areas, internet-connected devices, including phones, tablets and laptops, should be powered down. Where devices must be used, ensure phones and iPads are updated with the latest software version and placed in lockdown mode. And laptops should have Wi-Fi and Bluetooth switched off. Surprised they're not telling people to bring burner phones. That's the trust between the two countries.
Nothing to see here. Completely normal relations. Completely normal relations. Do not notice. Quick, look over there at what happened in the Senate. There'll be more to this. But will anyone be willing to talk about it? Well, we'll give it a crack. I mentioned before about the types of people that already are paying too much tax in this country, but most likely will end up paying more. It is the good people who are right in the damn middle. Now, the median income in Australia, I think, is the best part of about $80,000. Some obviously a little more, some obviously a lot less. But the truth is, the way that the pyramid scheme of the federal government is paid for is that it is not paid for by companies with multi-billion-dollar profits. It is not paid for by the GST, which of course is all money raised by the federal government and then given to the states. No, it comes from you and me. In fact, the 3 largest sources of money to the Australian federal government are 1, income tax, where it comes off your weekly, fortnightly, monthly pay. Company tax, where if you've got the right accountant, you'll be doing your best to pay as little as possible, but the reality is that's about $140 billion. But you can see that huge gulf, $200 billion between the workers and the people running the companies. And then the GST is way back where? So the GST, even at 10%, if it was doubled, it would only get to about $200 billion. So unless there's about to be a massive change in that, really the only way the government funds itself, and remember, the way the government funds itself is, firstly, by having more workers paying more tax, but then rather than closing the gap to last year when there wasn't enough workers paying enough tax for all of the promises they made. No. They just increase the promises, and we end up in $1 trillion worth of debt. Because there is an expectation of the next 10 years of budget deficits, that $1 trillion increases. Because according to the intergenerational report, those deficits will go for the next 44 years. You can expect $1 trillion in debt to become 1.5, $2 trillion in debt. But these people, and their little dog too, will have long left the political scene. Well done today in the Channel 9 newspapers, because they have started to have a little look at this, because they say that workers are going to face paying an extra $300 billion in tax. Now, remember, workers already pay $349 billion in tax. So we're close to talking a doubling of the total amount of income tax that the government gets. This is why they are addicted to immigration. This is why they want adults of working age to come here, so they pay their taxes straight away. And while the population right now is sitting at, 27, 28 million people, well, eventually you've got to get to 50 million because they pay for the previous 27 that are making their way through the aged care system. Working Australians face more than a $300 billion increase in extra income tax with a decade after the federal spending, if federal spending I should say, is not reined in, and low-income earners will bear the brunt of the growing tax impost, says a former Productivity Commissioner head. Michael Brennan, now the Chief Executive Officer of an independent think tank called E61, said the entire tax system would become more dependent on income taxes and less progressive, with people on the minimum wage facing the steepest hits to their take-home pay. Now, of course, that logic being that, as you know, tax-free threshold is about $40,000. Well, if the minimum wage slowly but surely increases, but that $40,000 tax-free threshold never changes, then they start to fall into tax brackets where they start to pay taxes. The total amount being added to the trough for the federal politicians, not to balance the books or to pay off $1 trillion worth of debt. No, it's just more spending on top of more spending on top of more spending on top of more spending. The Australian electorate has shown at how many elections in a row now that they can be bought. The triangle of dependence that means 50% of people have got their hand out or are recipients of government welfare. Believe that's unbelievably the case. People's employment is directly linked to the government because they work for state or federal public servants. There's more than, about 1.5, 2 million people like that. And if you're in private business, well, the single biggest customer is the government. Hence the $90-something million that was spent on the website redevelopment for the Bureau of Meteorology. So it is in the government's interest to keep spending because that creates greater dependence and eventually a permanent political majority. But the one thing it absolutely leads to is a series of deficits, increases debt, and at some point debt becomes the single biggest thing that you are trying to pay off each and every year. In fact, debt in Victoria alone is going to be $28 million, not a year, not a week, but a day, most likely before the next Victorian election. This stuff matters, no matter how often the politicians want to pretend. No, it doesn't. Now, the Senate has been a bit of action today, apart from what I mentioned before, including there was an opportunity for senators to all get together and vote down a terrible idea that the government was wanting to put in place. And this was to do with putting a time limit on when people can be given citations for their bravery in the battlefields of the world. They wanted to put in a 20-year limit, meaning that anything that was 20 years and a day ago, well, it had no longer qualified. If somebody had pulled out a diary that's never been read from World War I, too bad. If there was a bit of footage that turned up from Vietnam, ignore it, look the other way. They wanted to put this system in place. Now, of course, that's ridiculous. Well, they tried to put it up in the Senate. The plan was for a vote to take place today, and then it seemed pretty obviously that this was going to be friendless. Not even the Greens supported this ridiculous idea. Thankfully, people like the good senator from Victoria, Bridget McKenzie, well, she was all in on this today.
That the Australian government thinks that there is a time limit on service recognition. And we know that whether it is a decade, 2 decades, 4 decades, 5 decades, post an incident in the theatre of war or in even peacekeeping duties, that our servicemen and women deserve to recognise, particularly for the children and grandchildren of veterans deceased. The time limit, I think, was incredibly hurtful and harmful to their well-being.
So thankfully, the system stays as it is. You wouldn't imagine this is the most urgent thing. Again, talk about the spending, talk about the taxes, talk about the debt. No, these are the fiddling around on the edges. Why they did it, I don't know. There is now a move on for the government to apologise for even going down this path. The Shadow Veterans Affairs Minister, I'll show him here, but his staff didn't even respond to our request for an interview today.
The Prime Minister and the Veterans Affairs Minister should just apologise for the stress and the anxiety they put our veterans and our Australian Defence Force personnel through over recent months.
Just for the record, I wanted to talk to Darren Chester about many of the failings this government has had when it comes to Veterans Affairs, including at the end of 2025, can we actually have a check-in on how many of those recommendations from the Royal Commission into Veteran Suicide are being actioned at all? The invitation stands. I would have thought today would have been it, but if he's got other time, we'll see him later in the week. Let's talk about other people's money. This is how they spend what you work hard for. That is their single source of the greatest source of revenue. Like an almost 4-to-1 factor when it comes to the GST, almost 2-to-1 factor when it comes to company tax, and that is, of course, income tax. The Bureau of Meteorology website, I mentioned it before, unbelievably, they told us that the old site that became the new site that wasn't as good as the old site only cost about $4 million. Well, reality is it's $96.5 million. The total cost of the website is approximately $96.5 million. This includes the previously stated $4.1 million required to redesign the front end of the website. The remaining cost reflects the significant investment required to fully rebuild and test systems and technology that underpin the website, making sure that it is secure and stable and can draw on the huge amounts of data gathered from the observing network and weather models. This is the Bureau of Meteorology CEO. Yeah, but wouldn't all of that have applied to the previous website? Now, again, I get it. It's not being done for free and it's not being farmed out to the cheapest labour around the world, but $96.5 million, please. Now, there's been plenty of comment about this. I had much to say last night, a reminder about why you should always be joining us on a Sunday night for the first bite at the week's news. But David Littleproud, representing the communities who most look to the Weather Bureau for information, that being rural Australia, said this today about the cost.
It's disgraceful, and there's a cultural deficiency at the Bureau of Meteorology. They actually said publicly that it cost $4.1 million. It's now $96 million. And the fact that they have misled the Australian people in that way is disgraceful.
Now, you may have heard this story for the past couple of days, but you haven't heard this bit. This government, which of course finds new ways to hide information in their chamber of secrets, that refuses to answer questions at Senate estimates, well, they find a new way to get themselves out of scandals, including this answer from the Environment Minister and the Bureau of Meteorology, and presumably its spending on its new website would be known to the Minister. Now, remember, this is not the first time the government has been in power in 20 years. They have been in power now for multiple years. You would imagine there'd be quite a handover between the former Environment Minister and the current Environment Minister. But could you imagine how people would react if a Liberal minister's response to $96.5 million being spent on a freaking website, when they previously told us it was only $4 million, would have been treated? Well, this minister thinks he's got a clever way of you not having to ask at all.
The initial figure that the BOM provided in the range of $4 million was for one aspect of the website development. It's a matter for them why they chose to provide that figure rather than a broader figure.
And he goes on to say that he wasn't informed. Again, this sort of I know nothing approach. Now, remember, when the news is good, they know everything. They were involved in every decision. They dotted every I, they crossed every T. But this is a bit of a pattern. Remember when the Minister for Freebies, the one with so many free tickets, she's got tickets on herself, what she had to say when she was confronted with the government's failures to protect the 000 system that, of course, was exposed by the failures of Optus. This was her excuse.
I'm still a new minister to the industry, so I would say I'm listening to everybody at the moment.
Sorry? These people are on the board of directors of our country. The no one told me and I'm just new here is rubbish. Both have been ministers for a long time. Both have been cabinet ministers for a significant period of time. Yet for some reason, this is acceptable and much of the media will accept it. Why? Look over there, something crazy happened in the Senate. Now, speaking of weather and the Bureau and how it's got to get things right and how people constantly keep an eye on things, Darwin thankfully dodged the cyclone that made its way through there. Clean-up efforts were taking place today. There was also one heck of a storm that happened in southeast Queensland where, depending on where you live, there's a chance that the hail was very large. Here's Sky News weather.
A lot of damage from the hail with smashed cars and windscreens, which is really no surprise considering the sheer size and scale of those hailstones. So really that risk will continue throughout this evening and in tomorrow. Now it's all thanks to surface trough pulling in heat and humidity, causing all of that instability, allowing these showers and storms to fire up, particularly so across southeast Queensland and northeast New South Wales, which is pretty much the pattern continuing into Tuesday and Tuesday evening.
Now, we often talk about the problem of people being able to find a place to rent. The reality is that there's a whole bunch of homes that would otherwise be available for rent, but people sort of keep them for Airbnb. These are places they don't live in. These are the holiday house. And rather than renting that out for 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, you sort of rent it out for far more money every few weekends. But the places, therefore, that are left available in big cities, the prices for rents are through the roof. Now, this is the housing in which millions of people look to, but have a look at this. Sydney's Housing Affordability Index has absolutely crashed. Now, the start of this graph is 2021. The end of this graph is now. You can see that the affordability has absolutely tanked. It got smashed post-COVID in 21, 22, 23, levelled off in 24, slightly better towards the start of 25, but then back down to basement dwelling. To give you an idea, and particularly in the Sydney context of things, and there are similar pictures in different states, but again, like a weather map, the greener it is, the more affordable rental accommodation may be. The darker the colour, and particularly the reds, show you just how unaffordable things can be. Now, the reality of any map like this is, sure, if you go further enough out, eventually you'll find something you can afford. But if your job is closer to the city and the unaffordable bits, that means your commutes get longer and longer, the time that you spend with your family, less and less. The 2025 National Rental Affordability Index report has found, quote, not a single suburb in Sydney's east, lower North Shore or northern beaches is classified as affordable for renters. That's unbelievable. Meaning the average Sydney renter now must travel up to 20 kilometres from the CBD in order to find an affordable place to live. Now, I get it, not every single suburb's going to have a joint for a few $100s, but the reality is that we're talking about, in some cases, joints that are going for more than $1,000 a week. And by the way, the $1,000 a week doesn't come with a pool and ducted air conditioning. Job seekers and part-time workers on parenting payments are among those that are hit the hardest by the affordability crunch. Those receiving job seeker payments, the dole, now need to allocate 131% of their income towards rent in Sydney, meaning they can't possibly rent in Sydney, making independent housing virtually impossible without additional support. So perhaps two families in one place to pay for something. This is not a sign of a healthy economy. This is something that should be being dealt with by government, but of course, look the other way. Someone did something offensive in the Senate. A full-time hospitality worker would need to spend 42% of their income on rent. A single full-time working parent would spend 33%, well above the affordability threshold. So Australia is a beautiful place, but a hard place to live for lots of people. We need to have more homes being built for lots of different types of people. Now, it's fine that in existing wealthier suburbs, they're going to turn around and build more units. Well, they're going to be expensive units. Many of those will be just for sale. They won't be just for rent. So presumably the people who may buy an investment property are going to be doing so a little further out of town. Nothing new in all of that. But if your job's in the city, like say working for the hospital or working for the restaurant, in this case by Sydney Harbour, the travel home is very long. And in many times, that's lots of times on public transport, or in many times, if you happen to be driving, it's sitting in queues. Quality of life matters. Hopefully, if you're able to find a place to rent, it's near where the kids go to school, it's near where you have a job or have the opportunity to get a job. But for everyone who thinks, nothing to see here, the reality is there's plenty to see here. It's just many people don't want to look, including those who, of course, are the MPs who are here to rule us all like the kings and queens that they are.